Are you using the Nikon Z8 to its full potential? Are you missing critical setup improvements? In this video, I'll walk you through the exact settings I use on my Nikon Z8, how I customize the buttons for maximum efficiency, and my setup behind the lightning fast autofocus that makes all the difference in wildlife photography. My name is Mark Dumbleton. I'm a professional wildlife photographer from South Africa, and I can honestly say the Nikon Z8 is the best camera I have ever used. I've customized quite a lot on the Z8, so let's have a look. During the video, if you have any setup suggestions, please leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you. I'm going to go through the menu on the camera. I'm not going to dwell on the unimportant items in the menu. I'll only talk about the important ones and the settings I highly recommend you use. Now, the first one, primary slot selection. I highly encourage you to use a CF Express Type B card, not an XQD card and not a SD card. CF Express Type B cards are incredibly fast, and to get the best performance out of your Nikon Z8, I highly recommend a CF Express Type B. The camera shoots at very fast speeds, and the data that it needs to push through to the memory card is very important, and you don't want to create a bottleneck with your memory card. So CF Express Type B, that's what I use. Secondary slot function, I just put that to overflow. That goes to the SD card. Again, I don't like to use the SD card, but I will put an SD card in the camera just as a backup. Image area, I use the FX, so that's the full sensor. Image quality, only shoot in RAW. If you want to shoot in RAW plus a JPEG, you can use these other settings here, but I only use that RAW setting. RAW recording, this is very interesting. If you are shooting at very fast speeds, I use and would encourage you to use this high efficiency star. That is a RAW compression that drops the quality very, very slightly compared to a lossless compression. Now, I've done some extensive testing on these different formats, and I can't find a single difference between these RAW formats. So I use high efficiency star. That is going to give you a very good quality RAW file, but just drop the data size slightly compared to that lossless compression. That also helps the camera buffer shots and push out photographs to the memory card a lot quicker because there's slightly less data to push through. ISO sensitivity settings, this is what I use. I normally drop my ISO to 64 when I'm using this ISO sensitivity settings. Now my maximum sensitivity I go on the Z8 is 12,800. It can go higher, but I like to just keep it there, which gives me some decent quality. Minimum shutter speed, I just use auto. White balance, natural light auto. If you're shooting in RAW, white balance doesn't matter. You can choose white balance after you have downloaded your images into Lightroom. Now the picture control, I use a flat picture control, and although that doesn't affect the RAW file, that does affect the preview on your camera. So if you've got a very, let's say you've got a very high contrast scene, if you are using this flat profile, the histogram will be a bit closer to accurate representation of what the raw file data will be like. The problem is if you've got a very high contrasted, high saturated picture profile, that will reflect in your JPEG preview and the histogram, so it might push the histogram to something that is not quite accurate to what the raw file is. Color space sRGB, this setting does not matter if you are shooting in RAW. Active delighting off. Long exposure noise reduction off, high ISO noise reduction off. Those settings and vignette control, that should actually be to off. Those settings do not matter again if you're shooting in RAW, so don't worry about those. Auto distortion control off, these are all off. Let's go down to metering. Center weighted metering or matrix metering. I mainly use matrix metering because I like to meter off the entire sensor. Sometimes I will use center weighted or spot metering if it's a very challenging lighting condition. Go down to focus mode, AFC. You don't want to use single AF because once you focus, the focus will stop. If you have continuous AF, the camera will continue to change focus. So that's what I use there. Now, the AF area mode, I will go into this a little bit more in detail a bit later in the video. AF subject detection option, again, I'll speak about that when we do some autofocus stuff later on. Vibration reduction, I use sport when I'm panning with the lens. If my shutter speed is very low, I will switch that to normal just to allow for a stronger vibration reduction in some low light situations. Auto bracketing I don't use, multiple exposure, HDR, let's just go through here. These are all off. So video recording menu, I'm not going to go through because we are talking about photography. I'm going to go into the custom settings in a second. I just want to run through these other menus quickly. Now going into the setup menu, there's only a couple of very important settings to take note of. Camera sounds, I like to put my volume on 1. That just allows me to hear the shutter very, very softly, but anyone that's sitting next to me, they don't really hear the camera, which I like. It's a nice improvement over the old DSLR cameras. And then going down here to slot empty release lock. Make sure release is locked if you don't have a memory card. If you set this to enable release, the camera will try to take photographs, or it will take photographs, and it won't have a memory card to push the data to. So you might go through a whole day of shooting and not realize you don't have a card. So make sure release locked is locked there. If you are looking to improve your photography, I send out an email newsletter once a week to my subscribers. I share a lot of photo tips as well as editing tips and exclusive tutorials on that newsletter. So sign up via the link in the description below to receive photo tips every Friday. All right, let's go talk about custom settings. Now let's go into focus. AFC priority selection, I've got it on release. Now there's a lot to be said about these other modes, focus and release. And focus just allow the camera to either wait for focus to be perfectly locked on before it allows you to take a photograph, or focus and release is somewhere in between. So release, I have it set on, and that allows me to always press the shutter and it will take the photograph. Now the problem is if you have focus and release and focus, sometimes the camera won't shoot because it doesn't register or get that confirmation that the focus is 100% locked on. And I've often found that I've lost photographs because the camera hasn't allowed me to take a photograph. So I leave that on release. Now you are going to perhaps take a couple autofocus shots, but the autofocus on this camera is so good, I haven't really had much issue with that. So that's on release. AFS priority, I don't use AFS, so that is not important. Focus tracking with lock on. Now I haven't experimented with this a lot, but I've been pretty happy with the results being left on 3 and subject motion on steady. Now focus points used, I set alternating points. Otherwise, sometimes when I'm shifting a single point autofocus, there's a lot of dots on the screen, so you have to scroll through them quite a bit. Now I like to use alternating points, which allows me just more of a broader selection of points to use when I'm using the autofocus. Store points by orientation off. AF activation, I use the AF on only. Now on my camera, I use a back button focus setup with the AF on button. So that AF on button allows me to focus, and then the shutter button allows me to take the photograph. So the reason why I like to do it that way is because I like to separate the two functions. Now, when I am perhaps focusing and recomposing, it's nice to be able to focus with the back button, get the focus locked on perfectly, lift it up, and then with the shutter button take the photo, and I know the focus isn't going to move at all. So that's a good reason to use the back button focus. Focus point persistent auto. Let's just pass some of these settings here. These are not important. Focus point selection speed, I've just got that on normal. Go down to the metering section here. These are all set on defaults, I believe. Nothing very important there. Pre-release capture options. This is an interesting one. In my video I recently posted in the Kruger National Park, I used pre-capture, and here you can set the pre-release size or the burst amounts that you want to keep. So I leave it at 1 second, and that allows me to then keep 1 second's worth of photographs before I actually press that shutter. Now moving on to customizing the camera, and I think this is one of the most important aspects for me to get right, to make sure that I have an efficient camera in the field. And my main focus with the setup on my camera is to be able to focus the camera. That's the first priority. I need to focus the camera, and I need to be able to change between different modes and different subject detections very, very quickly. So the way that I've set it up, custom control shooting, the first function button I have set to go to my first item in my menu. Now that first item is AF subject detection. So when I'm photographing wildlife, I need to change my AF subject detection quite a bit. If I've got an animal or a bird, I want to be able to change it very quickly. So let's assume I'm photographing something. If I just tap that button, I can quickly then select birds and carry on. So there's a nice quick way to be able to change the AF tracking. The second function button is set to change my focus points to single point. Now, when I take photos, my initial AF area is a wide custom 2 area with subject tracking. So you can see on the screen now, the red box is where my camera is going to focus. Now, I've limited the area that the camera can focus, and I haven't done extensive testing on this, but I feel like if I give the camera less area to detect my subject in, I feel like that could improve the speed of that subject acquisition. So I use this wide area custom 2 with subject detection, and then just pressing that function button, that second one, I can quickly just change to single point there. So if I'm struggling to pick up a subject, or let's say there's a leopard in some thick grass and the subject tracking isn't picking up the leopard, then I can quickly change to single point, move the focus points around, and then pinpoint that focus on the subject. So that's a nice way to set up autofocus that allows me some very quick customization and to really use the settings that I need to be able to focus on my subject as good as possible. I don't use a battery grip there, and then I don't use that button for anything. This button I don't really use, but I've just set it to change it to FX mode or DX mode. Now this AF on button is the back button focusing I was talking about, so I use that to do back button focus. I use the sub-selector sensor button to select the sensor focus point. And then my display button I've set to also go to the top item in my menu. The OK button I set to zoom on and off, and then playback for playback. And these other ones I don't really use. Now this one I use to change autofocus modes. Again, when I'm shooting, I always use a wide custom 2 area, but sometimes I might just want to change that in specific scenarios. So that is one button that I will use just to change between different modes. You can see it changing there, but I'll put it back on wide custom 2, and that's my standard focusing mode. Exposure compensation, I'll leave that as the default. ISO is the default, and then these other ones I don't really use. Now these are the items in my menu. You can see AF subject detect options for photo and video, metering, ISO sensitivity settings, focus tracking with lock on, battery information. Sometimes I like to just check on the battery there, the raw recording, long exposure noise reduction. Now that will affect your raw file if you're shooting long exposures. If you're doing like a 20-second exposure, long exposure noise reduction will definitely work for your raw file, and self-timer if I'm shooting some landscapes. Let's have a look at the eye menu. So when I'm shooting, I can quickly switch between a few different things. Vibration reduction, I use sport like I mentioned earlier. It's a quick way to change it. White balance, here I can set my AF area mode if I want to. Interval timer shooting, these are not important. And then metering down there at the bottom. Now I just want to take you back to my shooting screen. You can see I'm using 20 frames per second. That is the fastest the camera can shoot in RAW. Now if you have a look here, I'm going to press down the shutter. You can see the camera is basically not buffering at all. It's still shooting. There, I must have shot maybe, I don't know, 200 shots. And because of that 20 frames per second, the camera's shooting incredibly fast. But because of that CF Express Type B card, the files are moving very quickly, and also together with that high efficiency star RAW format. So you could essentially almost shoot constantly at 20 frames per second in RAW with this camera. Now that is mind-blowing. For any action or any bird photographer, that is a real game changer in my opinion. I just want to go through my thought process about autofocus when in the field. Now my main focus mode is that wide custom 2 AF area mode with subject tracking. I shoot a lot of birds and I shoot a lot of wildlife, and I find the subject tracking, especially on this Nikon Z8 and I'm sure on the Nikon Z9 as well, the subject tracking is superb. So my go-to settings for focusing is that. Now sometimes the camera won't pick up the subject, and that's when I use that second custom button to change to single point. Now I can hold down that button and change the focus points with the selector button to fine-tune where I want that focus to be. So like in the example I mentioned earlier, the leopard in the long grass, subject tracking probably won't find that subject. And don't rely on the subject tracking at all times, but it does do a phenomenal job. Now sometimes I will use 3D tracking on the camera. I don't use that very much, and I do not use the full AF area with no subject tracking. I like to really dial in my settings relating to the subject that I'm shooting. Now that you know how to set up your Nikon Z8 for optimal wildlife photography, check out this video next where I review the Nikon 180-600, which pairs perfectly with the Nikon Z8.